Oh, hello, and welcome back to Baby Alice's Stories. We now return to 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. Part 2, Chapter 7. The Mediterranean in 48 Hours. The Mediterranean, the blue sea par excellence, the great sea of the Hebrews, the sea of the Greeks, the Mare Nostrum of the Romans, bordered by orange trees, aloes, cacti, and sea pines, embalmed with the perfume of the myrtle, surrounded by rude mountains, saturated with pure and transparent air, but incessantly worked by underground fires. A perfect battlefield in which Neptune and Pluto still dispute the empire of the world. It is upon these banks and on these waters, says Michelet, that man is renewed in one of the most powerful climates of the globe. But beautiful as it was, I could not only take a rapid glance at the basin whose superficial area is 2 million of square yards. Even Captain Nemo's knowledge was lost to me. For this puzzling person did not appear once during our passage at full speed. I estimated the course which the Nautilus took under the waves of the sea at about 600 leagues, and it was accomplished in 48 hours. Starting on the morning of the 6th of February, from the shores of Greece, we had crossed the Straits of Gibraltar by sunrise on the 18th. It was plain to me that this Mediterranean, enclosed in the midst of those countries which he wished to avoid, was distasteful to Captain Nemo. Those waves and those breezes brought back too many remembrances, if not too many regrets. Here he had no longer that independence and that liberty of gait which he had when in the open seas, and his Nautilus felt itself cramped between the close shores of Africa and Europe. Our speed was now 25 miles an hour. It may be well understood that Ned Land, to his great disgust, was obliged to renounce his intended flight. He could not launch the pinnace, going at the rate of 12 or 13 yards every second. To quit the Nautilus under such conditions would be as bad as jumping from a train going at full speed, an imprudent thing, to say the least of it. Besides, our vessel only mounted to the surface of the waves at night to renew its stock of air. It was steered entirely by the compass and the log. I saw no more of the interior of this Mediterranean than a traveler by express train perceives of the landscape which flies before his eyes. That is to say, the distant horizon, and not the nearer objects which pass like a flash of lightning. We were then passing between Sicily and the coast of Tunis, in the narrow space between Cape Bon and the Straits of Messina. The bottom of the sea rose almost suddenly. There was a perfect bank, on which there was not more than 9 fathoms of water, whilst on either side the depth was 90 fathoms. The Nautilus had to maneuver very carefully so as not to strike against the submarine barrier. I showed Conseil on the map of the Mediterranean the spot occupied by this reef. "But if you please, sir," observed Conseil. It is like a real isthmus joining Europe to Africa. Yes, my boy, it forms a perfect bar to the Straits of Libya, and the soundings of Smith have proved that in former times the continents between Cape Bocco and Cape Furina were joined. I can well believe it, said Conseil. I will add, I continued, that a similar barrier exists between Gibraltar and Ceuta, which in geological times form the entire Mediterranean. What if some volcanic burst should one day raise these two barriers above the waves? It is not probable, Conseil. Well, but allow me to finish, please, sir. If this phenomenon should take place, it will be troublesome for Monsieur Lesseps, who has taken so much pains to pierce the isthmus. I agree with you, but I repeat, Conseil, this phenomenon will never happen. The violence of subterranean force is ever diminishing. Volcanoes so plentiful in the first days of the world are being extinguished by degrees. The internal heat is weakened. The temperature of the lower strata of the globe is lowered by a perceptible quantity every century to the detriment of our globe, for its heat is its life. But the sun is not sufficient, Conseil. Can it give heat to a dead body? Not that I know of. Well, my friend, this earth will one day be that cold corpse. It will become uninhabitable and uninhabited like the moon, which has long since lost all its vital heat. In how many centuries? In some hundreds of thousands of years, my boy. Then, said Conseil, we shall have time to finish our journey. That is, if Ned Land does not interfere with it. And Conseil, reassured, returned to the study of the bank, which the Nautilus was skirting at a moderate speed. During the night of the 16th and 17th February, we had entered the second Mediterranean basin, the greatest depth of which was 1,450 fathoms. The Nautilus, by the action of its crew, slid down the inclined planes and buried itself in the lowest depths of the sea. On the 18th of February, about 3 o'clock in the morning, we were at the entrance of the Straits of Gibraltar. There once existed two currents, an upper one, long since recognized, which conveys the waters of the ocean into the basin of the Mediterranean, and a lower counter current, which reasoning has now shown to exist. Indeed, the volume of water in the Mediterranean, incessantly added to by the waves of the Atlantic and by the rivers falling into it, would each year raise the level of the sea, for its evaporation is not sufficient to restore the equilibrium. As it is not so, we must necessarily admit the existence of an undercurrent, which empties into the basin of the Atlantic through the Straits of Gibraltar, the surplus waters of the Mediterranean. A fact indeed, and it was this counter-current by which the Nautilus profited. It advanced rapidly by the narrow pass. For one instant I caught a glimpse of the beautiful ruins of the Temple of Hercules, buried in the ground, according to Pliny, and with the low island which supports it, and a few minutes later we were floating on the Atlantic. Chapter 8. Vigo Bay. The Atlantic, a vast sheet of water whose superficial areas covers 25 millions of square miles, the length of which is 9,000 miles, with a mean breadth of 2,700, an ocean whose parallel winding shores embrace an immense circumference, watered by the largest rivers of the world, the St. Lawrence, the Mississippi, the Amazon, the Plata, the Orinoco, the Niger, the Senegal, the Elbe, the Loire, and the Rhine, which carry water from the most civilized as well as the most savage countries. Magnificent field of water, incessantly plowed by vessels of every nation, sheltered by the flags of every nation, and which terminates in those two terrible points so dreaded by mariners, Cape Horn and the Cape of Tempests. The Nautilus was piercing the water with its sharp spur, after having accomplished nearly 10,000 leagues in 3 months and a half, a distance greater than the great circle of the earth. Where were we going now, and what was reserved for the future? The Nautilus, leaving the Straits of Gibraltar, had gone far out. It returned to the surface of the waves, and our daily walks on the platform were restored to us. I mounted at once, accompanied by Ned Land and Conseil. At a distance of about 12 miles, Cape St. Vincent was dimly to be seen, forming the southwestern point of the Spanish peninsula. A strong southerly gale was blowing. The sea was swollen and billowy. It made the Nautilus rock violently. It was almost impossible to keep one's foot on the platform, which the heavy rolls of the sea bent over every instant. So we descended after inhaling some mouthfuls of fresh air. I returned to my room, Conseil to his cabin, but the Canadian, with a preoccupied air, followed me. Our rapid passage across the Mediterranean had not allowed him to put his project into execution, and he could not help showing his disappointment. When the door of my room was shut, he sat down and looked at me silently. "Friend Ned, mon ami," said I understand you, but you cannot reproach yourself. To have attempted to leave the Nautilus under the circumstances would have been folly." Ned Land did not answer. His compressed lips and frowning brow showed with him the violent possession this fixed idea had taken of his mind. "Let us see," I continued. "We need not despair yet. We are going up the coast of Portugal again. France and England are not far off, where we can easily find refuge. Now, if the Nautilus, on leaving the Straits of Gibraltar, had gone to the south, if it had carried us towards regions where there were no continents, I should share your uneasiness. But we know now that Captain Nemo does not fly from civilized seas, and in some days, I think you can act with security." Ned Land still looked at me fixedly. At length his fixed lips parted, and he said, "It is for tonight." I drew myself up suddenly. I was, I admit, little prepared for this communication. I wanted to answer the Canadian, but words would not come. "We agreed to wait for an opportunity," continued Ned Land, "and the opportunity has arrived. This night we shall be but a few miles from the Spanish coasts. It is cloudy. The wind blows freely. I have your word, Monsieur Aronnaud, and I rely upon you." I was silent. The Canadian approached me. "Tonight, At 9 o'clock, said he. I have warned Conseil. At that moment, Captain Nemo will be shut up in his room, probably in bed. Neither the engineers nor the ship's crew can see us. Conseil and I will gain the central staircase, and you, Monsieur Aronon, will remain in the library 2 steps from us, waiting my signal. The oars, the mast, and the sail are in the canoe. I have succeeded in getting some provisions. I have procured an English wrench to unfasten the bolts which attach it to the shell of the Nautilus, so all is ready till tonight. The sea is bad. That I allow, replied the Canadian. But we must risk that. Liberty is worth paying for. Besides, the boat is strong, and a few miles with a fair wind to carry us is no great thing. Who knows but by tomorrow we may be 100 leagues away. Let circumstances only favor us, and by 10 or 11 o'clock we shall have landed on some spot of terra firma, alive or dead. But adieu now, till tonight. With these words, the Canadian withdrew, leaving me almost dumb. I had imagined that, the chance gone, I should have time to reflect and discuss the matter. My obstinate companion had given me no time, and after all, what could I have said to him? Ned Land was perfectly right. There was almost the opportunity to profit by. Could I retract my word and take upon myself the responsibility of compromising the future of my companions? Tomorrow, Captain Nemo might take us far from all land. At that moment, a rather loud hissing noise told me that the reservoirs were filling, and that the Nautilus was sinking under the waves of the Atlantic. A sad day I passed, between the desire of regaining my liberty of action and of abandoning the wonderful Nautilus, and leaving my submarine studies incomplete. What dreadful hours I passed thus, sometimes seeing myself and companions safely landed, sometimes wishing, in spite of my reason, that some unforeseen circumstance would prevent the realization of Ned Land's project. Twice I went to the saloon. I wished to consult the compass. I wished to see if the direction the Nautilus was taking was bringing us nearer or taking us farther from the coast. But no, the Nautilus kept in Portuguese waters. I must therefore take my part and prepare for flight. My luggage was not heavy, my notes nothing more. As to Captain Nemo, I asked myself what he would think of our escape, what trouble, what wrong it might cause him, and what he might do in case of its discovery or failure. Certainly, I had no cause to complain of him. On the contrary, never was hospitality freer than his. In leaving him, I could not be taxed with ingratitude. No oath bound us to him. It was on the strength of circumstances he relied, and not upon our word to fix us forever. I had not seen the captain since our visit to the island of Santorin. Would chance bring me to this presence before our departure? I wished it, and I feared it at the same time. I listened if I could hear him walking the room contiguous to mine. No sound reached my ear. I felt an unbearable uneasiness. This day of waiting seemed eternal. Hours struck too slowly to keep pace with my impatience. My dinner was served in my room as usual. I ate but little. I was too preoccupied. I left the table at 7 o'clock. 120 minutes, I counted them, still separated me from the moment in which I was to join Ned Land. My agitation redoubled, my pulse beat violently. I could not remain quiet. I went and came, hoping to calm my troubled spirit, my constant movement. The idea of failure in our bold enterprise was the least painful of my anxieties, but the thought of seeing our project discovered before leaving the Nautilus, of being brought before Captain Nemo, irritated, or what was worse, saddened at my desertion, made my heart beat. I wanted to see the saloon for the last time. I descended the stairs and arrived in the museum, where I had passed so many useful and agreeable hours. I looked at all its riches, all its treasures, like a man on the eve of an eternal exile, who was leaving, never to return. These wonders of nature, these masterpieces of art, amongst which for so many days my life had been concentrated, I was going to abandon them forever. I should like to have taken a last look through the windows of the saloon into the waters of the Atlantic, but the panels were hermetically closed, and a cloak of steel separated me from that ocean which I had not yet explored. In passing through the saloon, I came near the door, let into the angle which opened into the captain's room. To my great surprise, this door was ajar. I drew back involuntarily. If Captain Nemo should be in his room, he could see me. But, hearing no sound, I drew nearer. The room was deserted. I pushed open the door and took some steps forward. Still, the same monk-like severity of aspect. Suddenly, the clock struck 8. The first beat of the hammer on the bell awoke me from my dreams. I trembled as if an invisible eye had plunged into my most secret thoughts, and I hurried from the room. There, my eye fell upon the compass. Our course was still north. The log indicated moderate speed, the manometer a depth of about 60 feet. I returned to my room, clothed myself warmly, sea boots, an otter skin cap, a great coat of byssus lined with sealskin. I was ready. I was waiting. The vibration of the screw alone broke the deep silence which reigned on board. I listened attentively. Would no loud voice suddenly inform me that Ned Land had been surprised in his projected flight? A mortal dread hung over me, and I vainly tried to regain my accustomed coolness. At a few minutes to 9, I put my ear to the captain's door. No noise. I left my room and returned to the saloon, which was half in obscurity but deserted. I opened the door communicating with the library, the same insufficient light, the same solitude. I placed myself near the door leading to the central staircase, and there waited for Ned Land's signal. At that moment, the trembling of the screw sensibly diminished, then it stopped entirely. The silence was now only disturbed by the beatings of my own heart. Suddenly, a slight shock was felt, and I knew that the Nautilus had stopped at the bottom of the ocean. My uneasiness increased. The Canadian signal did not come. I felt inclined to join Ned Land and beg of him to put off his attempt. I felt that we were not sailing under our usual conditions. At this moment, the door of the large saloon opened, and Captain Nemo appeared. He saw me, and without further preamble began in an amiable tone of voice. "Ah, sir, I have been looking for you. Do you know the history of Spain?" Now, one might know the history of one's own country by heart, but in the condition I was at the time, with troubled mind and head quite lost, I could not have said a word of it. "Well," continued Captain Nemo, "you heard my question. Do you know the history of Spain?" Very slightly, I answered. Well, here are learned men having to learn, said the captain. Come, sit down, and I will tell you a curious episode in this history. Sir, listen well, said he. This history will interest you on one side, for it will answer a question which doubtless you have not been able to solve. I listen, Captain, said I, not knowing what my interlocutor
Interlocutor.
Interlocutor. A person who takes part in a dialogue or conversation. Interlocutor. I listen, Captain, said I, not knowing what my interlocutor was driving at, and asking myself if this incident was bearing on our projected flight. Sir, if you have no objection, we will go back to 1702. You cannot be ignorant that your King Louis XIV, thinking that the gesture of a potentate was sufficient to bring the Pyrenees under his yoke, had imposed the Duke of Anjou, his grandson, on the Spaniards. This prince reigned more or less badly under the name of Philip V, and had a strong party against him on board. Indeed, the preceding year, the royal houses of Holland, Austria, and England had concluded a treaty of alliance at The Hague. Hague, the seat of government and administrative center of the Netherlands, had concluded a treaty of alliance at The Hague with the intention of plucking the crown of Spain from the head of Philip V and placing it on that of an archduke to whom they prematurely gave the title of Charles III. Spain must resist this coalition, but she was almost entirely unprovided with either soldiers or sailors. However, money would not fail them, provided that their galleons, laden with gold and silver from America, once entered their ports. And about the end of 1702 they expected a rich convoy which France was escorting with a fleet of 23 vessels, commanded by Admiral Chateau Renaud. For the ships of the coalition were already beating the Atlantic. This convoy was to go to Cadiz, but the admiral, hearing that an English fleet was cruising in those waters, resolved to make for a French port. The Spanish commanders of the convoy objected to this decision. They wanted to be taken to a Spanish port, and if not to Cadiz, into Vigo Bay, situated on the northwest coast of Spain, and which was not blocked. Admiral Chateau Renaud had the rashness to obey this injunction, and the galleons entered Vigo Bay. Unfortunately, it formed an open road which could not be defended in any way. They must therefore hasten to unload the galleons before the arrival of the combined fleet, and time would not have failed them had not a miserable question of rivalry suddenly arisen. You are following the chain of events? Asked Captain Nemo. Perfectly, said I, not knowing the end proposed by this historical lesson. I will continue. This is what passed. The merchants of Cadiz had a privilege by which they had the right of receiving all merchandise coming from the West Indies. Now, to disembark these ingots at the port of Vigo was depriving them of their rights. They complained at Madrid and obtained the consent of the weak-minded Philip that the convoy, without discharging its cargo, should remain sequestered in the roads of Vigo until the enemy had disappeared. But whilst coming to this decision on the 2nd of October 1702, the English vessels arrived in Vigo Bay, when Admiral Chateau Renaud, in spite of inferior forces, fought bravely. But seeing that the treasure must fall into the enemy hands, he burnt and scuttled every galleon which went to the bottom with their immense riches. Captain Nemo stopped. I admit I could not see yet why this history should interest me. Well? I asked. Well, Monsieur Aronnaud, replied Captain Nemo, we are in that Vigo Bay, and it rests with yourself whether you will penetrate its mysteries. The captain rose, telling me to follow him. I had had time to recover. I obeyed. The saloon was dark, but through the transparent glass the waves were sparkling. I looked. For half a mile around the Nautilus, the water seemed bathed in electric light. The sandy bottom was clean and bright. Some of the ship's crew in their diving dresses were clearing away half-rotten barrels and empty cases from the midst of the blackened wrecks. From these cases and from these barrels escaped ingots of gold and silver, cascades of piastres and jewels. Piastres. Piaster, a momentary unit of several Middle Eastern countries, equal to 1/100th of a pound. Dollar Canadian. The sand was heaped up with them, laden with their precious booty. The men returned to the Nautilus, disposed of their burden, and went back to this inexhaustible fishery of gold and silver. I understood now. This was the scene of the battle of the 22nd of October, 1702. Here, on this very spot, the galleons laden for the Spanish government had sunk. Here, Captain Nemo came, according to his wont, to pack up those millions with which he burdened the Nautilus. It was for him, and him alone, America had given up her precious metals. He was her direct. He was heir direct, without anyone to share in those treasures torn from the Incas and from the conquered of Ferdinand Cortez. Did you know, sir, he asked, smiling, that the sea contained such riches? I knew, I answered, that they value money held in suspension in these waters at 2 millions. I knew, I answered, that they value money held in suspension in these waters at 2 millions. Doubtless, but to extract this money, the expense would be greater than the profit. Here, on the contrary, I have but to pick up what man has lost, and not only in Vigo Bay, but in 1,000 other ports where shipwrecks have happened, and which are marked on my submarine map. Can you understand now the source of the millions I am worth? I understand, Captain, but allow me to tell you that in exploring Vigo Bay, you have only been beforehand with a rival society. And which? A society which has received from the Spanish government the privilege of seeking those buried galleons. The shareholders are led on by the allurement of an enormous bounty, for they value these rich shipwrecks at 500 millions. 500 millions they were, answered Captain Nemo, but they are so no longer. Just so, said I, and a warning to those shareholders would be an act of charity, but who knows if it would be well received. What gamblers usually regret above all is less than the loss of their money than of their foolish hopes. After all, I pity them less than the thousands of unfortunates to whom so much riches, well distributed, would have been profitable, whilst for them they will be forever barren. I had no sooner expressed this regret than I felt that if I Then I felt that it must have wounded Captain Nemo. Baron, he exclaimed with animation, do you think then, sir, that these riches are lost because I gather them? It is for myself alone, according to your idea, that I take the trouble to collect these treasures? Who told you that I do not make a good use of it? Do you think I am ignorant that there are suffering beings and oppressed races on this earth? Miserable creatures to console, victims to avenge. Do you not understand? Captain Nemo stopped at these last words, regretting perhaps that he had spoken so much. But I had guessed that whatever the motive which had forced him to seek independence under the sea, it had left him still a man, that his heart still beat for the sufferings of humanity, and that his immense charity was for oppressed races as well as individuals. And I then understood for whom those millions were destined, which were forwarded by Captain Nemo when the Nautilus was cruising in the waters of Crete. Chapter 9. A Vanished Continent. The next morning, the 17th of February, I saw the Canadian enter my room. I expected this visit. He looked very disappointed. Well, sir, said he. Well, Ned, fortune was against us yesterday. Yes, that captain must needs stop exactly at the hour we intended leaving his vessel. Yes, Ned, he had business at his bankers. His bankers? Or rather his banking house. By that I mean the ocean, where his riches are safer than in the chests of the state. I then related to the Canadian the incident of the preceding night, hoping to bring him back to the idea of not abandoning the captain, but my recital had not other result than an energetically expressed regret from Ned that he had not been able to take a walk on the battlefield of Vigo on his own account. However, said he, all is not ended. It is only a blow of the harpoon lost. Another time we must succeed, and tonight, if necessary. In what direction is the Nautilus going? I asked. I do not know, replied Ned. Well, at noon we shall see the point. The Canadian returned to Conseil. As soon as I was dressed, I went into the saloon. The compass was not reassuring. The course of the Nautilus was south-southwest. We were turning our backs on Europe. I waited with some impatience till the ship's place was pricked on the chart. At about 11:30, the reservoirs were emptied, and our vessel rose to the surface of the ocean. I rushed towards the platform. Ned Land had preceded me. No more land in sight. Nothing but an immense sea. Some sails on the horizon, doubtless those going to San Roque in search of favorable winds for doubling the Cape of Good Hope. The weather was cloudy. A gale of wind was preparing. Ned raved and tried to pierce the cloudy horizon. He still hoped that behind all that fog stretched the land he so longed for. At noon, the sun showed itself for an instant. The second profited by this brightness to take its height. Then, the sea becoming more billowy, we descended, and the panel closed. An hour after, upon consulting the chart, I saw the position of the Nautilus marked at 16 degrees 17 minutes longitude and 33 degrees 22 minutes latitude at 150 leagues from the nearest coast. There was no means of flight, and I leave you to imagine the rage of the Canadian when I informed him of our situation. Pour moi, for myself, I was not particularly sorry. I felt lightened of the load which had oppressed me. I was able to return with some degree of calmness to my accustomed work. That night, about 11 o'clock, I received a most unexpected visit from Captain Nemo. He asked me very graciously if I felt fatigued from my watch of the preceding night. I answered in the negative. Then, Monsieur Aronnaud, I propose a curious excursion. Propose, Captain? You have hitherto only visited the submarine depths by daylight, under the brightness of the sun. Would it suit you to see them in the darkness of the night? Most willingly. I warn you, the way will be tiring. We shall have far to walk and must climb a mountain. The roads are not well kept. What you say, Captain, only heightens my curiosity. I am ready to follow you. Come then, sir. We will put on our diving dresses. Arrived at the robing room, I saw that neither of my companions nor any of the ship's crew were to follow us on this excursion. Captain Nemo had not even proposed my taking with me either Ned or Conseil. In a few moments we had put on our diving dresses. They placed on our backs the reservoirs, abundantly filled with air, but no electric lamps were prepared. I called the captain's attention to the fact. They will be useless, he replied. I thought I had not heard aright, but I could not repeat my observation, for the captain's head had already disappeared in its metal case. I finished harnessing myself. I felt them put an iron-pointed stick into my hand, and some minutes later, after going through the usual form, we set foot on the bottom of the Atlantic at a depth of 150 fathoms. Midnight was near. The waters were profoundly dark, but Captain Nemo pointed out in the distance a reddish spot, a sort of large light shining brilliantly about 2 miles from the Nautilus. What this fire might be, what could feed it, why and how it lit up the liquid mass, I could not say. In any case, it did light our way. Vaguely, it is true, but I soon accustomed myself to the peculiar darkness, and I understood, under such circumstances, the uselessness of the Ruhmkorff apparatus. As we advanced, I heard a kind of pattering above my head. Patter, 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 patter. The noise redoubling, sometimes producing a continual shower. I soon understood the cause. It was rain, falling violently and crisping the surface of the waves. Instinctively, the thought flashed across my mind that I should be wet through by the water. In the midst of the water, I could not help laughing at the odd idea. But indeed, in the thick diving dress, the liquid element is no longer felt, and one only seems to be in an atmosphere somewhat denser than the terrestrial atmosphere. Nothing more. After half an hour's walk, the soil became stony. Medusae, microscopic crustacea, and Nautilus lit it slightly with their phosphorescent gleam. I caught a glimpse of pieces of stone covered with millions of zoophytes and masses of seaweed. My feet often slipped upon this sticky carpet of seaweed, and without my iron-tipped stick, I should have fallen more than once. In turning round, I could still see the whitish lantern of the Nautilus beginning to pale in the distance. But the rosy light which guided us increased and lit up the horizon. The presence of this fire under water puzzled me in the highest degree. Was I going towards a natural phenomenon, as yet unknown to the savants of the earth? Or even, for this thought crossed my brain, had the hand of man aught to do with this conflagration? Had he fanned this flame? Was I to meet in these depths companions and friends of Captain Nemo whom he was going to visit, and who, like him, led his strange existence? Should I find down there a whole colony of exiles who, weary of the miseries of this earth, had sought and found independence in the deep ocean? All these foolish and unreasonable ideas pursued me, and in this condition of mind, overexcited by the succession of wonders continually passing before my eyes, I should not have been surprised to meet at the bottom of the sea one of those submarine towns of which Captain Nemo dreamed. Our road grew lighter and lighter. The white glimmer came in rays from the summit of a mountain about 800 feet high. But what I saw was simply a reflection, developed by the clearness of the waters. The source of this inexplicable light was a fire on the opposite side of the mountain. In the midst of this stony maze, furrowing the bottom of the Atlantic, Captain Nemo advanced without hesitation. He knew this dreary road. Doubtless he had often traveled over it and could not lose himself. I followed him with unshaken confidence. He seemed to me like a genie of the sea, and as he walked before me, I could not help admiring his stature, which was outlined in black on the luminous horizon. It was 1 in the morning when we arrived at the first slopes of the mountain, but to gain access to them, we must venture through the difficult paths of a vast copse. Yes, a copse of dead trees, without leaves, without sap, trees petrified by the action of the water, here and there overtopped by gigantic pines. It was like a coal pit still standing, holding by the roots to the broken soil, and whose branches, like fine black paper cuttings, showed distinctly on the watery ceiling. Picture to yourself a forest in the Harz, hanging on to the sides of a mountain, but a forest swallowed up. The paths were encumbered with seaweed and fucus, between which grovelled a whole world of crustacea. I went along, climbing the rocks, striding over extended trunks, breaking the sea bindweed which hung from one tree to the other, frightening the fishes, which flew from branch to branch. Pressing onward, I felt no fatigue. I followed my guide, who was never tired. What a spectacle! How can I express it? How paint the aspect of these woods and rocks in this medium? Their underparts dark and wild, the upper colored with red tints by that light which the reflecting powers of the waters doubled. We climbed rocks which fell directly after with gigantic bounds and the low growling of an avalanche. To the right and left ran long dark galleries where sight was lost. Here opened vast glades which the hand of man seemed to have worked. I sometimes ask myself if some inhabitant of these submarine regions would not suddenly appear to me. But Captain Nemo was still mounting. I could not stay behind. I followed boldly. My stick gave me good help. A false step would have been dangerous on the narrow passes sloping down to the sides of the gulfs. But I walked with firm step without feeling any giddiness. Now I jumped a crevice, the depth of which would have made me hesitate had it been among the glaciers on the land. Now I ventured on the unsteady trunk of a tree, thrown across from one abyss to the other, without looking under my feet, having only eyes to admire the wild sights of this region. There, monumental rocks, leaning on their regularly cut bases, seemed to defy all laws of equilibrium. From between their stony knees, trees sprang like a jet under heavy pressure, and upheld others which upheld them. Naturally, towers, large scarps, cut perpendicularly like a curtain. inclined at an angle which the laws of gravitation could never have tolerated in terrestrial regions. 2 hours after quitting the Nautilus, we had crossed the line of trees, and 100 feet above our heads rose the top of the mountain, which cast a shadow on the brilliant irradiation of the opposite slope. Some petrified shrubs ran fantastically here and there. Fishes got up under our feet like birds in the long grass. The massive rocks were rent with impenetrable fractures, deep grottos and unfathomable holes, at the bottom of which formidable creatures might be heard moving. My blood curdled when I saw enormous antennae blocking my road, or some frightful claw closing with a noise in the shadow of some cavity. Millions of luminous spots shone brightly in the midst of the darkness. They were the eyes of giant crustacea crouched in their holes, giant lobsters setting themselves up like halberdiers and moving their claws with the clicking sound of pincers. Titanic crabs pointed like a gun on its carriage, the frightful-looking poulps interweaving their tentacles like a living nest of serpents. We had now arrived on the first platform, where other surprises awaited me. Before us lay some picturesque ruins, which betrayed the hand of man and not that of the Creator. There were vast heaps of stone, amongst which might be traced the vague and shadowy forms of castles and temples, clothed with a world of blossoming zoophytes, and over which, instead of ivy, seaweed and fucus threw a thick vegetable mantle. But what was this portion of the globe which had been swallowed by cataclysms? Who had placed these rocks and stones like cromlechs of prehistoric times? Where was I? Whither had Captain Nemo's fancy hurried me? I would fain have asked him, had not being able to. I stopped him. I seized his arm, but shaking his head and pointed to the highest point of the mountain, he seemed to say, "Come along, come higher." I followed, and in a few minutes I had climbed to the top, which for a circle of 10 yards commanded the whole mass of rock. I looked down the side we had just climbed. The mountain did not rise more than 700 or 800 feet above the level of the plain, but on the opposite side it commanded from twice that height the depths of this part of the Atlantic. My eyes ranged far over a large space lit by a violent fulguration. In fact, the mountain was a volcano. At 50 feet above the peak, in the midst of a rain of stones and scoriae, a large crater was vomiting forth torrents of lava, which fell in cascade of fire into the bosom of the liquid mass. Thus situated, this volcano lit the lower plain like an immense torch. Even to the extreme limits of the horizon, I said that the submarine crater threw up lava, but no flames. Flames require the oxygen of the air to feed upon and cannot be developed underwater, but streams of lava, having in themselves the principle of their incandescence, can attain a white heat, fight vigorously against the liquid element, and turn it to vapor by contact. Rapid currents bearing all these gases in diffusion and torrents of lava slid to the bottom of the mountain like an eruption of Vesuvius on another Terra del Greco. There indeed under my eyes, ruined, destroyed, lay a town, its roofs open to the sky, its temples fallen, its arches dislocated, its columns lying on the ground from which one would still recognize the massive character of Tuscan architecture. Further on, some remains of a gigantic aqueduct, here the high base of an acropolis, with the floating outline of a Parthenon. These traces of a quay, as if an ancient port had formerly abutted on the borders of the ocean, and disappeared with its merchant vessels and its war galleys. Farther on again, long lines of sunken walls and broad deserted streets, a perfect Pompeii escaped beneath the waters. Such was the sight that Captain Nemo brought before my eyes. Where was I? Where was I? I must know at any cost. I tried to speak, but Captain Nemo stopped me. Stopped me by a gesture and picked up a piece of chalkstone, advanced to a rock of black basalt, and traced the one word: Atlantis. What a light shot through my mind. Atlantis, the Atlantis of Plato, that continent denied by Origen and Humboldt, who placed its disappearance amongst the legendary tales. I had it there now before my eyes, bearing upon it the unexceptionable testimony of its catastrophe. The region thus engulfed was beyond Europe, Asia, and Libya, beyond the columns of Hercules, where those powerful people, the Atlantides, lived, against whom the first wars of ancient Greece were waged. Thus, led by the strangest destiny, I was treading underfoot the mountains of this continent, touching with my hand those ruins 1,000 generations old and contemporary with the geological epochs. I was walking on the very spot where the contemporaries of the first man had walked. Whilst I was trying to fix in my mind every detail of this grand landscape, Captain Nemo remained motionless, as if petrified in mute ecstasy, leaning on a mossy stone. Was he dreaming of those generations long since disappeared? Was he asking them the secret of human destiny? Was it here this strange man came to steep himself in historical recollections and live again in this ancient life? He who wanted no modern one? What would I not have given to know his thoughts, to share them, to understand them? We remained for an hour at this place, contemplating the vast plains under the brightness of the lava, which was sometimes wonderfully intense. Rapid tremblings ran along the mountain caused by internal bubblings. Deep noise, distinctly transmitted through the liquid medium, were echoed with majestic grandeur. At this moment, the moon appeared through the mass of waters and threw her pale rays on the buried continent. But it was but a gleam. But what an indescribable effect! The captain rose, cast one last look on the immense plain, and then bade me follow him. We descended the mountain rapidly, and the mineral forest once passed. I saw the lantern of the Nautilus shining like a star. The captain walked straight to it, and we got on board as the first rays of light whitened the surface of the ocean.